Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the country or what time of the day it is, depending on the Earth's rotation. We're so happy to have you. We're going to be discussing the Americans with Disabilities Act today, which is, as you all know, if you're joining and have been following NCLD, it's its 30th anniversary. I just want to start by talking a little bit about the Americans with Disabilities Act and its importance. So the ADA, for those of you who aren't familiar, protects anyone with a physical or mental health impairment, which substantially limits one or more life activities. So if you have a identified disability or unidentified, you are in many cases covered by the ADA. It protects children's rights both outside of school and inside of school, so it includes camps. It will, and most importantly, I think for the purposes of our guest, Dr. Gay Barnes, and also your children in the future as adults, is that ADA protects civil rights of individuals with disabilities when they're adults and in the workforce. So it's an incredibly monumental, bipartisan civil rights law that we are celebrating the 30th anniversary of. And so grateful to, if Dr. Barnes doesn't mind me aging her, have an amazing teacher who started her career when the ADA was getting going. So Dr. Gay Barnes, would you introduce yourself to those watching?
I certainly would. I'm Gay Barnes. I currently work as an assistant professor of education at Birmingham Southern College in Birmingham, Alabama. I retired in 2016. Yeah, I still take checks that way too. I retired in 2016 after a little more than 26 years in the classroom. So I started teaching in 1987, was my first year in the classroom. And I taught a variety of different grades. Most of my teaching life was in early childhood. And so that's my deal.
Great. And friends, don't let friends be not pat their own backs. Dr. Barnes is also, what year were you State Teacher of the Year, National Teacher of the Year finalist, Gay?
I was the 2012 National Teacher of the Year. No, I'm sorry. Can I start that over? I was the 2012 Alabama Teacher of the Year and a 2012 National Teacher of the Year finalist.
Great. And so Gay has been in the classroom. I know she's also has family and grandchildren with disabilities themselves. So grateful, Gay, to have you with all the different hats that you wear, whether it's higher ed or K-12 or just families, an advocate. We're really grateful to have you. So I mentioned, and again, apologies for aging you, but just you started your education career as an educator when ADA was just emerging. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what that idea and reality of ADA meant for the kids you were working with and also the adults and your peers.
So the first year that I taught in a small private Montessori school, and I had a multi-age classroom. So I had 20 students with me who were first grade through sixth grade. It was, again, a very, very small school. But many of the students in my classroom, at least some of them, in hindsight, I recognized that they were there because they were having a difficult time in the public education setting. And again, in hindsight, I realized that was in part because of some mental health issues that they had that were not addressed. And when I transitioned into public ed, I think that's one thing that has shown up certainly from the time I started teaching in 1987 until when I retired in 2016. That increase of numbers of students, particularly that had significant mental health issues that we didn't see in my career that we see more often. And I think in some instances that's also because we identify better now, but I do think there's an increase in those things that are happening for students. And so one change that I've seen is that increase in numbers, but also our ability to respond to, ADA helps bring that to the forefront, that is a disability that children live with, and that we have a responsibility and a need, to help them figure out and to support, particularly in our public school settings.
It's great. And I wonder also if you'd agree with this, but it feels like sometimes we talk about statues like they're lines in paper, but there's enormous advocacy that goes into creating something like the ADA. And that advocacy itself ushers in a cultural change in terms of how we think about disabilities. And I wonder if, have you seen that at all in play in the years since the ADA passed, whether it's for your students or your peers that may have had disabilities?
I think I love that idea of advocacy. And I've always considered myself first and foremost as a teacher and as an advocate for my students. And there have certainly been times when I've gotten crossways with administrators or with people in a central office position, because I've always taken that very, very seriously. Like, I will just straight up say to a parent, I'm here to advocate for your child, not for the school or for the school system.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes, when you need to be a voice for children, it's not always the thing that is going to make it easy for a school or a school system. And so I think the idea of advocacy and our role as public educators in being advocates for students and families, because I think for to have disabilities, it's not just a child, it's a family issue. And so that while we're working with that child in a school setting for 7 hours a day, for families, that's a 24/7 situation. And earlier that, I have children and grandchildren, and three of my own children have learning disabilities. And so very early, I learned the importance of advocating for them and also teaching them how to advocate for themselves.
Yeah. Yep.
We also have a 3-year-old granddaughter who had a stroke prior to her birth and has some significant disabilities in more than one domain. So there's intellectual disabilities, there are physical disabilities. She now has a diagnosis for cerebral palsy, epilepsy, cortical visual impairment. And while I've always considered myself as an advocate and I've always taken that role really seriously, being a family member and watching everything that goes into play just to get this baby out the door in the morning has brought a whole different perspective to that. And so I think, again, the ADA serves to bring that front and center, and it provides support and scaffolding and compels people to support and help children. And, I was thinking about this earlier and thinking about our meeting today, but I don't know that I've ever taught. I can't think of any time in my career where I've taught with a teacher who had a physical disability where they needed to be in a wheelchair or that kind of thing. But certainly, again, those mental health issues that are covered under ADA are so important, and that people sometimes struggle with silently. I think it brings to the forefront the importance of advocates and advocacy for supporting people in the workplace.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, because I think one of the issues of stigma is that when you have a physical disability, it's very visual, but when you have those other disabilities that you're referring, it's inside that person. So and they may not, you may not, as a person interacting with them, even know that, but that there is a law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, that protects them in all these different sorts of ways. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit because obviously this isn't just about your students advocating. It strikes me that one of the goals that we have for students in general around developing their self-advocacy skills is knowing their disabilities, what they mean and what they don't mean, knowing their rights, and knowing how to advocate for themselves and their peers who may have those be in those same sort of protected categories. And those are things that we want our students to have, but as they grow older and transition into adulthood. And so I wonder what you see the value of the Americans with Disabilities Act with those young adults and those older adults that may have disabilities and want to work in the education system and work in education.
Yeah, I think the first thing is to know they exist, that there are protections, right? That those are not things that should ever keep you from being an educator.
Mm-hmm.
And I think many times I'm thinking of one of my colleagues who's young enough to be one of my children, actually, who is herself a person with some learning disabilities, and the powerful impact she makes on students, because when she encounters a student who struggles. You know, I always felt like that was a strength of mine as a classroom teacher, because I had witnessed that with my own children, the difficulties that they had learning. And I felt like that made me a better teacher. It made me a better advocate for my students. It made it much easier for me to have difficult conversations with parents and families. But there wasn't anything that came close to watching this person teach. So students act and advocate at faculty meetings, and to share information and resources with families for, you know, for how they could do that, and to say to her own students, yeah, I had the same thing going on when I was a kid. Let me tell you how I did it. This might be something for you. And so I think there's, you know, if we don't recognize that value, then we lose just a whole group of talent and strengths that we could bring into the classroom to students in an entirely different way.
Yeah, I had never actually thought about that as an implication, but that idea that when you have civil rights laws like the ADA, it invites people who depend on those protections, whether they ever use it or not, to be in a specific space. And the implication of that for the education enterprise is that then it allows those young people who may have those same sorts of issues to be educated by those individuals. And if you never have those sorts of civil rights laws, and if you kind of water them down, then you don't have that same sort of invitation for those young adults and adults to enter that profession and to be those sorts of role models.
And that's, you know, that's so critical. We talk all the time in education about windows and mirrors, and we talk about how important it is for our students to see themselves, right? Have windows where they can look out and see things that are different than they are. And I think we're very conscious about, you know, racial issues now. I think we're less about it in other ways, so that it's just as powerful. You know, if I'm a student who uses a wheelchair for mobility, it's just as important for me to see teachers in my building who do that as well. If, you know, it's a teacher who has a visual impairment, I mean, it's just as important for, you know, we want our students to see themselves in all of the situations that they find themselves in. And so for students in our public schools, that's a powerful thing, to be able to see someone who is like you in that regard, and to know that you can be a teacher too, right? It's such a powerful model.
Yeah, it strikes me just in terms of when you were talking about your grandchild and your children and the challenges that they've experienced and barriers that they're working through. I think that it strikes me that a lot of those same issues are going to be exacerbated in the current context with regards to the COVID pandemic. And I want to see if you have any thoughts in terms of these sorts of civil rights laws, their importance, especially in periods of change and uncertainty as we're experiencing as communities, states, and a nation. What are the importance of things like ADA in light of the current context in your mind?
You know, I think we're in this unprecedented pandemic. Schools had to close. Just literally, you know, most people were in schools on Friday afternoons. They told their students goodbye, and that was it.
Yeah.
Places March 13th seemed to be the day. And it's a conversation that I've had with many of my teaching colleagues. It impacted our granddaughter. You know, school was closed. So she attends this amazing school where, you know, it is the sole function, the purpose, the reason it was created was to support children with cerebral palsy. They certainly serve children with other disabilities as well. She receives all of her therapies there. They're trained to know how to do her tube feedings. And so everything shuts down, and suddenly she doesn't have access anymore. And I think access is really the key thing, right? How do we, so now we've moved into this pandemic situation. So Boston is 3, so clearly she's not in a public ed setting yet. But, you know, fast forward 3 years, she would have been. And so certainly there are children that we serve in our public school systems all across the country who have the same kinds of disabilities and challenges that she has. And then teachers are trying to figure out, how do we support those students? So I think the big thing is, again, that we actually have this civil rights law that says it may not be easy, but we are going to do it. And I think that public educators have just surpassed anybody's expectations of what it might look like. So I think, again, the biggest thing is that it exists, and so that we know that protection is there. I don't think it was perfect, you know, in the last several weeks. I think people tried everything that they knew to provide the same kinds of access that had been happening in their classrooms. It certainly wasn't always possible. But again, the fact that we have this piece of legislation that says you are required by law to do these things, that causes people to remember that it's there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Most people are going to do the right thing anyway, but just in case, right?
Yeah.
This is important. It is law. And that keeps the conversation, because I haven't seen any school system where I have friends from all over the country now, that are teachers. I haven't seen any conversations that have excluded how are we responding for students who need support with access, and certainly the mental health parts. That's been a concern for educators for a number of years. Again, the fact that anecdotally we feel like we see more and more young children who have significant mental health issues.
Yeah.
And we don't see that. It's not always as evident, but that has certainly been a huge conversation among educators I know across the country, is how do we address and how do we support students who are not physically with us in our classrooms, but children that we know have some mental health issues already happening. How are we supporting them? How are we checking in? How are we making certain that they have what they need to still be able to access the education that we're trying to give them?
Yeah, and it strikes me that this is all those issues that you're talking about are going to get exacerbated if you're experiencing trauma and mental health issues. By the current the current isolation and everything that we're experiencing are only going to exacerbate those issues, and to have something sort of protection that comes in. And it also just, again, I'm just thinking about these things in different ways, just hearing you talk about it. But it strikes me as like, this is the challenges that our students face, maybe like a shadow, but kind of like the civil rights law shines the spotlight to make sure that we don't lose sight of the students who would otherwise be put in the shadow.
I think it's really important. And I think it helps for people who are trying to advocate, right? Again, it shines the spotlight on that. It verifies that is it important. It is an important thing that we're going to do for children. And it helps leverage it. It helps teachers be able to leverage bringing that back up in the conversation. So you're going to do all of these things. Okay, now how will that support this particular child that has these specific needs, and that, every child is equally important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, Gail, let me just, last question for you on this is that ADA is now 30 years old. If we had you on this, a similar, I don't know if we'd have holograms in 30 more years or how we would have this, but say we were celebrating the 60th anniversary 30 years from now, what would your hopes be for ADA in the next 30 years now?
I think the biggest hope, I think that the visibility allows for inclusiveness. And that building on the work that's happened in the last 30 years, that we've made it visible. ADA has made all of this visible now. And that has allowed for people to be included in ways that they weren't perhaps 50 years. And so my hope would be that we keep building on that piece of it, and that we don't let go of anything unless it's the parts that aren't working, and that we scaffold that we build on that to make it stronger and more significant, that we really embrace the idea that by being inclusive, by providing everybody access, that we are honoring the strengths and talents that everybody brings to the table, and that we recognize that it's not just good for people with disabilities, it's good for everybody. Yeah. I think we've done a good job of recognizing that it's helpful for people who have disabilities, and it is, but it's good for everybody. And that's the thing. We lose out on so much when we don't include everybody.
Gay, I am grateful that however we met, I am grateful to have you as a colleague and friend. Thank you so much for being an advocate and joining us. Any parting words for our audience?
Just thank you for inviting me. I will talk about this work until the cows come home. So to be brief, and I may not have made sense.
No. We'll keep calling you.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Gay. Have a great rest of the day. And
thank you, you too, Ace.
To our, if you are watching at this point, please share the word, because we know that civil rights laws are only strong as the advocates who protect them and raise their awareness. So we're grateful to Dr. Gabe Barnes for joining us and being one of those advocates, and we are grateful for you, the viewer, for joining us in that journey. Thank you so much and have a great rest of the day.